UK. His Culture and Pedagogy book in 2001 won outstanding.
No speaker again.
Sorry? Oh, I'll carry on. And his work as director of the Cambridge Primary Review won the SES Book Awards First Prize. He's, in short, an absolute expert in this area, and I'm really, really delighted to have this opportunity to have him join us this afternoon, and look forward to when we can meet physically and not just virtually. So over to you, Robin Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, those I can see. Good afternoon, those I can't. In the matter of oracy, history is almost as important as evidence. Evidence tells us why oracy matters, what teachers should do and what works. History tells us why, knowing the evidence, we haven't done it already. My written submission surveys both the evidence and the history in greater detail than is possible today. Attached to that submission are a paper I wrote in 2012 for a DFE seminar on spoken language in the national curriculum, which at that time was under review, and an account of our 2014 to 17 trial of dialogic teaching by the Education Endowment Foundation. Dialogic teaching is the distinctive approach to enhancing the quality and power of classroom talk on which I've been working since the 1990s. The EEF trial, randomized control, independent, involved 5,000 Year 5 pupils, many of them disadvantaged, in 3 English cities. After a dialogic teaching intervention of just 20 weeks, the intervention group pupils were 2 months ahead of their control group peers in tests of English, maths, and science. In light of this and other evidence, what can we conclude? First, inclusive and cognitively challenging talk makes a demonstrable difference to pupil engagement, learning, and attainment. Second, we can pinpoint the kinds of talk that exert the greatest leverage. Third, although talk is a universal feature of classroom life, talk of the quality required is not universal. Making it happen requires skill and training. Your briefing asks about the value of oracy. That begs the question of what oracy means. Too often it's conceived as giving children confidence in presentational speaking, but little else. Too often it's mired in the politics of standard English. Of course, we want children to become confident communicators and to use appropriate linguistic registers. But we all know people who confidently communicate rubbish, whether in the pub, the office, or PMQ, and some of them use standard English. Educationally productive talk aims higher than this. It blends the social with the cognitive, oracy for communicative competence with oracy for thinking and learning. At best, it helps children to articulate, explain, describe, imagine, speculate and hypothesize, to question, discuss, deliberate, reason and argue, to justify, defend, probe and challenge, and much more. Each of these is a way of thinking as well as speaking. Constrain the language and you constrain the thought. Liberate one and you liberate the other. Further, if children need talk to learn about the world, teachers need talk to learn about children. When talk is genuinely dialogic, it gives teachers access to children's minds. In John Hattie's phrase, it makes their learning visible. And by doing so, it makes teaching more precise, targeted, and effective. So I'm wary of the term oracy sometimes. In relation to this larger vision, I worry about the narrow way it's sometimes used. I worry about the danger of compartmentalizing oracy and setting it in opposition to literacy, when the spoken and the written are in fact interdependent. And I worry that our wholly proper focus on the child may divert attention from the teacher's agency. Talk by its nature is contingent upon others, and children's talk develops through a range of interactions inside and outside school. But in classrooms, it's chiefly through the teacher's talk, especially the way questions are posed and answers are handled, that the pupil's talk is encouraged, enriched, and extended, or sadly inhibited. So the teacher's talk matters too. Your briefing claims, I quote, a growing consensus about the importance of oracy. Yes and no. After all, the word oracy was first coined in 1965. Since then, There have been numerous research studies, national reports, a national oracy project, and yes, growing interest in the professional and research communities, supported by large-scale projects like my EEF Dialogic Teaching Trial and Neil Mercer's ESRC study. But consensus has been cyclic and patchy. There have been good times for oracy and bad. Speaking and listening were prominent in all the earlier versions of English national curriculum. In the current version, they had to be fought for. Despite the advice of Tim Oates' expert panel in 2011, and the international evidence that Lauren Resnick and I presented at that DFE seminar in 2012, ministers decided that from 2014, spoken language would not have a separate program of study, and indeed would be barely mentioned. It was only after sustained lobbying by Jim Rose, Neil Mercer, and myself that DFE changed its mind and sanctioned a spoken language program of study, much of which, in fact, was drafted by the three of us. But it was heavily constrained and less detailed than we wanted. So what about that consensus? Well, professionally and evidentially, we've made progress. Politically, I don't think so. The mindset that killed Link and the National Oracy Project remains alive and well. So when you ask whether the speaking and listening requirements of the current national curriculum framework are sufficient to deliver high quality oracy education, I have to say, no, they are not. They're too brief, too generalized to provide teachers with the guidance on content and progression through the key stages that they need. Worse, their brevity signals that spoken language doesn't matter. Years 1 to 6, 80 pages for reading and writing, 2 for speaking and listening. You ask about statutory assessment. You'll not be surprised if I say, tread very carefully. Leaving aside the question of spoken language in GCSE English, ill-conceived oracy tests at a national level could be disastrous. They could close down talk rather than open it up. And tests are individual, but talk is collective and reciprocal. So how, if discussion and argumentation are as important as experts believe, do we measure the individual contribution? In fact, talk of a truly dialogic kind is by its nature evaluative. In dialogic classrooms, teachers and children listen, think carefully about what they hear, build upon what is said. The best kind of oracy assessment then is formative, embedded in the teaching, and frameworks are available to support that task. That's where we should start, especially with younger pupils. You ask about barriers. Here's a telling statistic from the National Curriculum Review. In 2011, only 41% of respondents to DFE's call for evidence agreed that speaking and listening should be statutory. I've mentioned political attitudes, but there may also be questions about professional culture. You ask how teachers can find time for oracy. I suggest that this question is misconceived. In classroom, talk is a constant, so it's a matter not of finding time, but of using time well, ensuring that the talk is all that is already at the heart of teaching and learning becomes talk of the highest quality. Finally, you ask whether teachers need support or professional development. We wouldn't dare claim that teachers need no knowledge or skill to teach reading and writing, nor should we contemplate this for speaking and listening. There are several reasons why our EEF project raised standards, but here are 3. It was firmly grounded in evidence, it made high quality talk central to both teaching and learning, and such talk was fostered through a carefully structured program of professional training and support. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was really insightful and fascinating. But I'll go in with the advice. We'll do questions right at the end and invite everybody to sort of come back and make comments. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Neil Mercer, who's the Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge and a Director of the Study Centre Oracy Cambridge at the Cambridge College Hughes Hall, who was previously a Professor of Language and Communications at the Open University, who is also a Director of the Centre for Language and Communications and Director of the Centre for Research in Education and Educational Technology. So thank you so much for joining us, another expert in this field, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yes, I thought I ought to treat this like just a minute and not hesitate or deviate from the subject and keep to time. So I will, rather unusually, stick pretty closely to my notes, I think. I applaud all that Robin Alexander has just said about talking classroom interaction. I fully support what he said there, as he knows. But I want to focus today on Oracy education as the teaching and learning of communication skills. My life's research has been on the relationship between language and thinking and on the implications of that relationship for education. And my centre, Oracy Cambridge, was created to forge links between research and educational practice. And we've submitted written evidence based on what we have and others have done. But our main focus is Oracy education. So what do I mean by this? I mean expressly teaching young people how to use spoken language effectively to get things done. This requires more than simply providing opportunities for talk in the classroom, just as maths education requires more than opportunities to use numbers. It means teachers taking an active role in developing their students' spoken language skills. When I address the new trainee teachers on our course in Cambridge, I always ask them, when you were at school, how many of you received any instruction or guidance in speaking? The very few who put their hands up will have gone to private schools. And they mentioned debating clubs, drama lessons, and interview training. Very few British young people get any Oracy education. Yet in later life, spoken communication skills will be more used to most of them than skills in things like algebra. By Oracy education, I should make it clear, I don't mean the kind of elocution lessons that my mother used to threaten me with to try and get rid of my regional accent. I don't think we all need to learn to sound the same. And I don't think we need to learn to forget a local dialect to learn standard English any more than we need to forget English to learn French. It's a matter of broadening our speech repertoire. That is, we should all learn how to make a good presentation in public, conduct a reasoned discussion, work well in a team, listen properly to a speaker, and not least, participate well in an online meeting. These things should be taught to every child. It's often assumed that children need to be taught to read, but that they'll naturally learn how to use spoken language. If you speak to any primary teacher who's just had a new intake of children, you'll know that they will not agree with those things. It's also often assumed that good public speakers are born and not made. None of these assumptions are correct. Children may never have taken part in a reasoned discussion at home. And surveys show that most people are scared stiff of speaking in public. So how will they learn how to do these things unless they're taught in school? School represents the only chance for many young people to develop a language repertoire for dealing with all kinds of situations. I believe that oracy should, like literacy, be an intrinsic part of the curriculum. As Robin said, the current speaking and listening component is not enough. We at Cambridge and others like Voice 21 have developed effective teaching methods. We know exactly how to teach spoken language skills, so there should be no obstacle if teachers are trained how to do so, and if oracy is valued in Ofsted inspections. Employers regularly tell us they want to recruit young people with good communication skills. And as well as giving young people skills that will serve them well in the world of work, oracy education will also enable them to participate more fully in our democracy. Is it a coincidence that 30% of MPs went to private schools? Oracy education offers other benefits. We know that the level of young children's spoken language skills correlates with a later academic achievement, but schools can change children's destinies. Our research has shown that being taught how to take part in reasoned discussions boosts children's individual thinking skills. It also improves their attainment in maths and English. Oracy skills, once learned, will help them in the study of all subjects. So the potential benefits of Oracy education in this sense are great. I therefore urge policymakers to, first of all, put Oracy education firmly into the mainstream curriculum, which means it is expressly taught and assessed. Second, ensure that teachers are trained in how to teach spoken language skills. And third, ensure that Ofsted recognises good Oracy teaching as an essential part of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Another sort of, I got already hundreds of questions in my mind about sort of reacting to that as someone who is an MP and didn't go to private school and then obviously was a teacher as well. But I want to move on to our next speaker. So I'm delighted that Tim Oates has joined us. He's the Director of Assessment, Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment. He focuses on national and international research on assessment and measurement. In 2010, he published Could Do Better, which laid down the principles for the review of the national curriculum in England. He was the chair of the expert panel for review of the national curriculum in England, and emerging from this view, subsequent research on the quality and function of textbooks and other resources have been taken up around the world. He chairs various curriculum groups at the Department of Education in England as well. So another sort of highly regarded expert. So thank you for your time this afternoon, and I look forward to your contribution. Welcome.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks very much indeed for the invitation to present today. I'm not going to run through the strength of the evidence, which I think both Robin and Neil have outlined with precision. And I certainly pick up Robin's point, which is that Oracy is a portmanteau term, which refers to many things which we would not emphasise in a curriculum which is really focused on high quality Oracy. So I do think that we need to be very clear in the manner that Robin outlined. Suffice it to say that during the National Curriculum Review and on a continuing basis, we place enormous emphasis on Oracy in learning. And it must be explicit and it must be deliberate. And it present through from early years, from first formation through to adult experience and learning. I mean, it is essential for cognitive development, social development, and for young people, integration into schooling, the emotional integration into schooling. And very much defer to Neil's work at Cambridge and Robin's work in the Cambridge Primary Review with all of the colleagues who summarised the evidence on Oracy within that review. But I'd like to extend that to other international evidence, for example, on the nature of classroom exchange in Shanghai, the nature of classroom exchange in Singapore, which we know is deliberate and is linked to high attainment. Lucy Crehan, actually, in Cleverlands, which is a kind of popular book, but actually quite deeply theorised, outlines some of that extremely clearly. Now, what I'm going to do, Chair, is really focus on some of the legislative, the legal basis for this, and the public policy issues. And I'm going to go quite quickly. So, in the 2010 to 13 review, resulting in the 2014 national curriculum, for the first time, actually, Oracy was emphasised extremely strongly in all subjects. I depart slightly from Robin's view, because I think sometimes something is only mentioned once in the national curriculum, but it's still a legal requirement. And no matter how many times something is mentioned, I mean, it may convey informally in the way that Robin emphasises, but the national curriculum, the programmes of study are law. And what we have in the 2014 national curriculum is a statement of the necessity for high quality oral exchange in every subject. And that's a change from the preceding versions of the national curriculum since the 1988 Education Reform Act. Now, I'll just read out what we have in the aims for mathematics. So spoken language in the national curriculum of mathematics says, the national curriculum for mathematics reflects the importance of spoken language in pupils' development across the whole curriculum, cognitively, socially, and linguistically. The quality and variety of language that pupils hear and speak are key factors in developing their mathematical vocabulary and presenting a mathematical justification, argument, or proof. They must be assisted in making their thinking clear to themselves, as well as others and teachers, and teachers should ensure that pupils build secure foundations by using discussion to probe and remedy their misconceptions. Now, a single paragraph, but you can see by that formulation, which appears in an appropriate form in every national curriculum subject, it picks up all of the key themes which Neil and Robin have outlined about deliberate nature, the role of the teacher, and so on. This is really very important. Now, it is a legal requirement. It's a legal requirement on all schools. Ah, no, it's not. It's a legal requirement on maintained schools. So our national curriculum is not a national curriculum in that sense. So if we want to have the kind of potent emphasis on the forms of oracy which we know result in better equity and attainment, we have to do more than just include it in the national curriculum. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And why is it that you are concerned? Why is it that others are concerned? Well, understanding by teachers. It needs to be incorporated in curriculum development in schools, and that there's a need there for professional development. How can we get a focus on oracy? We need to think of the public instruments, inspection, Ofsted activities, its role within the inspection framework, general awareness raising across the profession, very important. Let's also think, therefore, about Bill Schmidt's framework in TIMS of intended curriculum, enacted curriculum, learned curriculum, and assessed curriculum. If something's intended but not enacted, it won't be learned, and it certainly won't be assessed. We need to use that framework to have the right policy, public policy instruments, including the national curriculum, in order to get enactment in the classroom. Because as Neil's work outlines, it's only minute by minute enactment that will result in what we actually need to see occurring within learning. So we have specific understandings of oracy, we have good theorization, we know what we're after. What we don't have is effective practices. We do have a clear statement in law, repeated across all subjects, not just English, of the importance of oracy, but it's not being enacted in all schools. And we've certainly done huge amounts of work in Cambridge in assessment in relationship to the nature of high quality questions, which enable us to probe through assessment, children's thinking, understanding, and the nature of their competence in oracy. We now have to make sure that that is a seamless aspect of instruction, as well as forms of assessment. So to summarize, it is essential. It's essential for cognitive, social development and integration into schooling. The actuality is that it's already very clearly stated in the national curriculum, and this is heavily evidence-based, drawing on the work of Neil Mercer, the work of the Primary Curriculum Review, and other bodies of evidence from other nations. But it's not required formally in all schools, and it's certainly not discharged in all schools. Therefore, we need to think about the instruments that we can use for ensuring that that does take place. What we have really available in actuality is professional development and the frameworks around that, the inspection process, and the possibility of assessment. But like Robin, I say tread carefully in assessment. Let's just think, what is the most effective public policy instrument that there has been in education? You may not feel it's the best, Emma, but it's certainly been the most effective, had the most impact, and that's the English Baccalaureate. It is not a legal requirement. It is a target. It is not legally obliged. And yet schools comply with it. And immediately, within hours of its announcement, were busily restructuring their curriculum. So we need to think with due realism as to what teachers really pay attention to. Those things that come out of the centre which change behaviour. I think this is quite challenging in respect of oracy, because anything that we do, any public policy instruments that we formulate, have to ensure that the enactment remains faithful to what we know from research, very particular understandings of oracy, very particular practices. So really the aim is this. We need to achieve what so many policies in education want to achieve: better attainment, higher attainment, and better equity, the two together. And we need specific practices permeating all subjects, and we need to use the time well. It should permeate learning. It should not be seen as something special or particular, only done on specific occasions.
Thank you so much for that. Really sort of interesting insight into the thinking behind the inclusion and how it's been included in the national curriculum and the problems that you mentioned in terms of implementing it in the classroom. I'm leaving in 3 minutes, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker and then hand the chair over to my dear colleague, Ian Mearns, who's from the Education Select Committee, and will take over the chair. And this will be available as a recording afterwards. I'm certainly going to be watching it this afternoon and hearing the questions that people ask. So do keep putting, everyone listening, please keep putting questions into the chat box, and they will be picked up after the final speaker. So I'm just really pleased to be introducing our next speaker, Mary Myatt, who's an education consultant and author. And I've known of Mary's work for a very long time and always found her to be engaging, informative and delightful speaker. So I'm really pleased that she's here. She's been a teacher and advisor, an Ofsted lead inspector, and I think this gives her quite a unique insight into what quality teaching looks like. She works in schools talking to pupils, teachers and leaders about learning, leadership and the curriculum, and I think that does give a different perspective to the conversation so far. So I'm sorry I won't be able to listen to it now, but I will be listening to it later. But welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Emma. So colleagues, there are 3 strands that I'd like to share in relation to this agenda. And the first is that it's my belief that it's a basic human right for every individual, regardless of their age, their background, in whatever setting, to articulate their ideas and to have their voices heard. So for me, there are 2 aspects to oracy. One is the talk, but to talk into a void is disheartening. So that void needs to be filled by people and individuals listening. The second strand of entitlement is that there is an entitlement within the national curriculum, and the English national curriculum has 4 elements, of which the first is speaking and the next is listening. And I do see those 2 as going together. Tim has already identified that the national curriculum is for maintained schools, but we know that the expectation is that for those schools who do not have to follow the national curriculum instruments, that what they offer their pupils and students is at least as ambitious. So I hold on to that. The second element I'd like to refer to are some of the barriers for why high quality talk and its sibling listening is not happening as well and is not as embedded as it might be in many of our settings. So this is not universally the case, but it is the case more often than not that there are barriers. So one of the barriers, I believe, is that the power of talk is poorly understood. And so there are plenty of assumptions that because virtually everyone can make sound, that just happens organically, and that what needs to be sitting behind it is a real understanding that overcomes that assumption about what it takes to have high quality talk in place as an entitlement for every child in every classroom, in every setting. A further problem is one of evidence. And so we have a culture permeating many of our settings that takes the view that if it cannot be captured on a spreadsheet, it hasn't happened. And so this is a real problem with schools who do not understand the importance of deep learning that happens minute by minute and over time that will not be evident necessarily in one moment. A further barrier is that within the sector, there's a tendency to privilege writing above everything else. And I don't just mean this in relation to the English national curriculum. I think this applies to virtually every subject, that somehow learning has not happened unless there's a written outcome. But I think it's no coincidence. I'm happy to be corrected here, but when you look at the 4 strands of the English national curriculum of speaking, listening, reading, and then writing, I take the view that those all stand in relation to one another and are cumulative. But somehow within our settings, it gets short-circuited so that we end up privileging writing before the others. But the fact is that we cannot write well unless we have first spoken. As James Britton said in 1970, writing floats on a sea of talk. Now, I'm not just arguing for high quality talk in that instrumentalist sense of producing high quality writing. I do believe this goes something much deeper that speaks to our humanity. And the final barrier that I've identified in the time that I have is that we have a number of colleagues saying that they have children in their classes who are shy. And therefore they should not be expected to articulate their ideas. So for me, this is akin to a teacher saying, well, a child is shy, they don't need to learn their times tables, or a child is shy, they don't need to be taught phonics or to read or to write. I regard this as a fundamental piece of a child, element of a child's panoply and range of instruments through which they're learning. I had a very moving experience talking to a group of deputy head teachers a while ago about a child who had been in some dire circumstances, was adopted by a family who lived in London. The child went to School 21, and she said that the adopted father sent her the 4-minute video of the child giving their speech without notes to an invited audience. So my argument is that a child from whatever background, whatever disadvantages they might have, with absolute support, can make that happen. So where it works well then, very briefly, I think that School 21 have led the way absolutely in this work in relation to this work being embedded in schools beyond the legal aspects, really bringing this work to life through Voice 21. If you visit the school or you look at the website, what you notice there is the absolute joy in learning for all those young people, whether it's primary or secondary, how articulate they are, and crucially, how they listen to one another. There's work going on at Jeremy Hannay's school, Three Bridges in London, Simon Smith School, East Whitby, Yamina Beebe's school, all these people embedding high quality oracy through proper structures, and it's making a difference to those children. And I would finish by saying this, that it's my own observation, and I'm a statistic of one, so I'm happy to be have people disagree with me on this, but in my work in schools, what I've noticed is that 9 times out of 10, there's a very strong correlation between children's talk, the way they talk about what's happening in their classrooms, the extent to which they are articulate and confident in expressing that, and the final judgment that they have as an Ofsted grading. Now, I'm not saying that correlation is causation, I just say I've noticed that 9 times out of 10. So finally, what might be a lever for embedding this? I think we've only got to look at the impact that the quality of education judgment has had in the latest inspection framework from Ofsted for schools to really take the curriculum seriously. That has the opportunity to honour the work of the schools that have always taken this seriously. It's raised the game for everyone else, and I think there's a case to be made for Oracy being included in the future. Thank you.
Mute myself. That's a good start. Thank you very much, Mary. That's very, very good of you. We are pressed for time. We've still got a number of speakers, so I'll move swiftly on to Professor Dame Alison Peacock, who's the Chief Executive of the Chartered College of Teaching. Alison was Executive Head Teacher of the Wroxham School in Hertfordshire, a career to date to span primary, secondary and advisory roles, and in 2018 she became an Honorary Fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge, one of the first ever female fellows admitted. So Alison, over to you. Lovely to see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here and in such august company as well. Of course, I spent several years working very closely with Robin Alexander with the Cambridge Primary Review and learned a tremendous amount at that time. But I want to share with you my learning from them, but also my learning from when I was a head teacher of a school that we researched for Learning Without Limits. When I arrived at that school, it was in special measures, it was in dire straits. It was a primary school with nursery. And the first thing I did was say that this was going to become a listening school. You will know from looking at the research that the amount of talk that teachers engage in far exceeds the amount of time listening to students and pupils. So what I was trying to do as head of that school was to approach the improvement of that school in an alternative way. And what we were doing was we were giving a real sense of agency to the community, to the children, to their parents, to the teachers. This was a collective endeavour. The first thing that we did was to establish circle meetings. These were weekly meetings, mixed age meetings, where the children would talk about what mattered to them within the school. All the children would take notes. The year sixes would lead the meeting. So these were an alternative to school council meetings. They were an alternative to the kinds of meetings where the most articulate get chosen to represent the rest. So these circle meetings happened every week for all children from year 1 to year 6. What started to happen was we were starting to shift the culture. The culture was one of an expectation that your voice would be listened to and that what you said mattered. And that's really absolutely intrinsically important in this work. So in the spirit of this, when we're listening to children, when we're thinking about the kinds of work they may be doing and how we may assess that work, why on earth wouldn't we be listening to the children about what they feel they can do next, how much capacity they feel they have to challenge themselves further, and what they can tell us about what they've understood, but also where their misconceptions lie. So we began to involve the children. In fact, we asked the children to lead on parent-family consultations. And I've sent a video for the APPG team to look at later, which is a video of a year 6 child leading a learning review meeting. These meetings were held in my office with me as the head teacher, with the parent, with the child. And it would be a 15-minute meeting. The autumn term, the spring term, and the summer term, the children wrote their own reports. I'll come on to that in a moment. Those 15-minute meetings were led by the children. They prepared 4 slides on PowerPoint to talk about what their challenges and their successes were in their learning. We had the children's books in front of us. The child would start the meeting, then the teacher would comment, the parents would comment as well, and I would be there as head teacher to listen to what the child was saying they were finding difficult, listen to what the child was saying about what was maybe too easy or what perhaps they would like to do more of, listening to what the parents said. I was listening to the parents' relationship with the teacher's relationship with the child, and so on. Keeping records of that, coming back to that meeting a term later, and then all of us were holding each other to account around how do we help the child's learning. So the child absolutely at the centre, but the child leading the conversation. And I have to say to you, even children with profound additional needs were able to do this. They maybe came and visited my office beforehand and sat on the chair to make sure that it was an environment where they would feel safe. But they were able to share with their parents in an incredibly proud way what they were understanding about their learning. And I really can't understand really why we don't do more of this. Then there were things like I said to you about the children's report. So the children would reflect on their learning through the year, and they would write that on a laptop, and then the teacher would respond. So again, another way of articulating what is the learning that's taken place, what's happened that's really making a difference, what am I finding really difficult. Again, if you can't actually speak about these things, you can't write about them. Very early on in my career, I worked with somebody called Annabelle Dixon. She was a very established early years teacher, and she talked about the fact that you have to play a story so that you can say a story. If you can't say a story, you can't write a story, and that continues all the way through. Even to the point now where if I'm writing something, if I don't actually know what I'm talking about, it's pretty difficult to make any sense out of it. We would work in classrooms in a way where the children were encouraged to engage in structured talk. one of the things that Tim Oates referred to was the mathematics that he referred to in Shanghai. We had teachers from Roxham who visited Shanghai who began to understand that the power of children actually explaining their thinking. So they would explain their thinking to their learning partner. Then some of the children would be chosen to explain their thinking to the rest of the class. And the whole point behind this was that you actually made the learning visible, as Robin said. You actually made that kind of cognitive process visible to everybody else, but also to the young person who was explaining their thinking as well. A really, really powerful way of embedding the mathematical learning and also revealing the misconceptions. So all of this is about the power of oracy. I think too often we associate oracy somehow with a kind of left-wing sort of let them all just navel gaze and think about philosophical inquiry. Actually, it's an incredibly rigorous process. So we would engage in things like philosophy for children, where they would be thinking about really quite challenging ideas and really having to explain their thinking to someone else and argue their point. All of these things are important life skills. The children engaged in peer mediation on the playground. When I first went to that school, Ofsted had described the children as unteachable. Their behaviour was so bad. We quickly became an outstanding school, and one of the ways in which behaviour was managed was through peer mediation on the playground, as I've described, where the children would be trained to listen and to ask open questions. But also we would ask the children to write what had happened. They would just write down on a behaviour incident form their side of the story. Really important that they were listened to and that we weren't making assumptions about what had happened. Too often in schools, children complain that schools aren't fair or teachers aren't fair or it's not a fair process. And in primary schools where you can absolutely capture joy, it's because they're schools full of energy where everybody knows that they have a voice and they're understood. And all of this comes back to the centre of what we've been talking about this afternoon. So I would emphasise that this is not just it's not just an academic pursuit, but it is an academic pursuit. It's not just about fairness, but it's really important in terms of creating a culture where everybody knows they're valued. It's about a way of teaching and learning. And one of the reasons that I went into working at the Chartered College where I am now is all about how do we help our teachers be as confident as they can be in enabling the best from their students. And it does take a confident teacher to ask students what they think. My goodness me, they might ask you a question and you might not know the answer, but that's the whole point, isn't it? So I applaud this meeting. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you.
Alison, thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. We now move on, and we have two representatives of our inspectorate with us. We have Sarah Hubbard, who's Schools HMI and Subject Lead for English in the Curriculum Unit at Ofsted, and Jonathan Kay, who's Senior HMI Curriculum Unit at Ofsted. Sarah, as an HMI, was a subject lead for English primary and secondary, and her inspection experience includes special and independent schools and initial teacher education. She's also obviously a qualified teacher. And Jonathan Kay, as an HMI, is also a qualified teacher, and prior to joining Ofsted, led a large city primary school as a head teacher. So over to you, please. Sarah, are you first?
Yes, I am. I think I'm the only one who's got a presentation, so doing something a bit different from everybody else. So hopefully that will work. So I'm just going to share my screen, first of all. Should be coming up now. Sorry, it's just gone to the second one. Great. I'm just going to put it back to the first one. So just to say, you know, how delighted Ofsted are to be at the Speak for Change inquiry at such a crucial time in education, and how interesting it's been for me to hear from esteemed colleagues over the last hour, and how fascinating it's been and how honoured it is to be here. Jonathan is going to join at the end to answer some questions, but I'm going to crack on without further ado to the slides. Just going to give you a chance to remind yourself of the focus that we're going to have in this presentation. Okay, those are the aspects we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be focusing on spoken language. And hopefully echoing some of the things I think that we've heard in the presentations so far. So the first question that you asked us was about the speaking and listening elements of the current curriculum. Are they sufficient in order to deliver a high quality Oracy education? So the 2014 national curriculum provides useful high-level spoken language goals, which defines what pupils should know and be able to do by the end of Key Stage 2 and the end of Key Stage 4. Schools should use these goals to create the building blocks that pupils need to succeed in spoken language. We know that defining the steps pupils need to take to achieve these goals is not easy, and schools are working this, and colleagues have talked about the rigour involved in that. These building blocks should be carefully planned and sequenced at all stages, including in early years. I think that's a theme that we've had previously in what colleagues have said in their presentation. And we know how important it is for children to be deliberately introduced to new words, which they then practice. This develops their ability to learn new knowledge and to express their ideas in spoken and written forms, a connection that colleagues have made. Finally, the 2014-19 national curriculum also emphasises vocabulary, grammar, and standard English, which are key aspects of spoken language. And just to clarify that term standard English, because I know that it has been raised, what we mean is English that's correct, that enables you to become an active citizen, you know, to gain entrance to the career professionals. And also it's what Jeff Barton calls the language habits of those who wield power. So it's that restricted code that you get access to through learning about standard English. It's not about pronunciation or accent. You asked us about the role of assessment increasing provision of Oracy education. Summative assessments can lead to schools focusing on the end goal, the composite, the final performance, rather than designing the curriculum building blocks required to achieve the composite. A simpler way of putting this point is that you don't get better at all the different elements of spoken language by continually practicing, say, making a speech to an audience. This is a perverse incentive, because although the intention of that introduction of a summative assessment would be to improve spoken language, its very existence might lead to unhelpful practices, such as the example I've given. Similarly, ongoing assessment does not necessarily improve spoken language. For example, in early years, continuous assessment of communication and language has not led to strong improvements in this prime area of learning. We know when speaking and listening was assessed as part of the English GCSE and also contributed to pupils' final grades, it was problematic. And reasons for this included variability in pupils' performance and unreliability in the way it was assessed, some of the things that I think have been mentioned before. Just to clarify, in that penultimate bullet point, we referenced the GCSEs. We know that there is a spoken language requirement in the current GCSE, but it carries no tariff, but is necessary in order to achieve the qualification. 2B. In the second part of question 2, you asked us, what is the most appropriate form of assessment of Oracy skills? And is this the best way to incentivise teachers to deliver more Oracy education? So we said, and I think this is something that's been echoed previously, that formative assessment that checks on people's retention and understanding is an appropriate form of assessment. It also helps teachers to develop a clear view of the building blocks of the spoken language curriculum. An important way to help teachers is by ensuring that they have the subject knowledge that they need to teach pupils these building blocks, especially grammatical knowledge and vocabulary knowledge. It's empowering for teachers to know which components their pupils need to really master in order to succeed. From my experience, teachers are motivated by knowing that their pupils are learning, you know, i.e. knowing more and remembering more. That really motivates teachers. You asked us about the barriers within the educational system that prevent schools in being able to prioritise oracy and what might better support this. Schools do not always identify the building blocks required for pupils to achieve expertise in spoken language, those small component parts that are so important in order to get to that kind of final goal. This can be a barrier. Another barrier is teachers not always well enough supported through training and other aspects so that they gain a strong grasp of subject-specific vocabulary and standard English. And that's very much in the context, as I've said before, not around pronunciation or accent, but very much around this idea of a kind of code that will enable you to be an active citizen and will enable you to, you know, gain entry into the professions, which we feel is a matter of social justice and is very strongly written in our handbook as well. There can be a mistaken assumption that activities based on talk automatically improve spoken language. So we decided to group questions 4 and 5 together, and these refer to the current circumstances and whether there's a need for better development of children's oracy skills. And you also asked us about the impact of school closures and isolation on children and young people's early or continual language development, how this will impact upon those that are already at a disadvantage in society and widen the existing language gap. We'd like to start by stating that Ofsted shares the deep concerns of the wider education sector about the impact that school closures are having on pupils, especially those that are most disadvantaged. Research indicates that school closures will have a negative impact on children's learning and progress. Some children, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, rely on their schooling to develop effective spoken language, e.g. through hearing and using new vocabulary. We know how important schooling is to both acquiring language in early years and deepening vocabulary stores so that pupils can understand what they read. One example of this was picked up during a pilot visit. A teacher told the inspector about a child with whom he'd worked incredibly hard, and the child had learned that crucial difference between the th and the duh sound before lockdown. And now on the return to school, the child had confused the and duh. And so was routinely saying dare instead of there. And that's just a little example of what I'm talking about. So finally, you asked us about Oracy playing a role in supporting students transition back to the classroom and social reintegration when schools return. To answer this question, we'd really want to first draw attention to a distinction between the very important talk that pupils might engage in, where they share their experience and activities, and that in which pupils specifically develop their expertise in spoken language. There may be children who need opportunities to talk about their experiences. Allowing children to articulate their thoughts and emotions is going to be very helpful and important. Ofsted recognises that over the past few months, schools and communities they serve will have suffered bereavements and traumas. Schools often play a crucial role in the healing process of both individual pupils and communities. There may be children who need to talk about their experiences one-to-one with staff or other pupils, and some individuals may need bespoke therapies which involve multi-agency collaboration. Talking through events and coming to terms with them is a very different form. It's very different from developing knowledge and skills in the different forms and functions of spoken language. It's important that schools are clear about these differences. If schools have a clearly defined spoken language curriculum, then they will be able to pinpoint any gaps and close them. Government guidance published very recently on the 2nd of July emphasised that schools may consider how all subjects can contribute to the filling of gaps in core knowledge, for example, through an emphasis on reading. And we know, don't we, that reading supports spoken language and vice versa. So that's something I think very important in that guidance. So just to summarise some of the key points we made, the 2014 National Curriculum clearly defines high-level spoken language goals. These can support schools in the important job of planning and sequencing the building blocks for success in spoken language across all subjects. Summative assessment is not an effective means of increasing spoken language provision, nor of incentivising teachers. Teachers are empowered when they have the necessary subject knowledge to teach all aspects of spoken language, and that includes knowledge of subject-specific vocabulary. There are a number of barriers to spoken language development: a lack of clarity about the building blocks that make up the spoken language curriculum, and I've referenced before the issue of subject knowledge, which we think is really important and is foregrounded in our handbook. So that's the presentation that we've made. And I think we're moving towards questions, aren't we? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Jonathan, was anything that you wanted to add to that before we open it up to questions?
I didn't know. Thank you very much. Sarah's covered the main points there. I'm just here on hand for some questions. I think Emma did send some through, so I'll just wait to see what we pick up now as a result of the discussions and contributions. Thanks there.
Okay. And Gemma, there's a number of people have asked questions or made points in the chat box. Are you going to handle that, or do you want me to do it?
I can have a quick review and we can come back to some of those questions in a bit. I'll keep encouraging everybody to post their questions in there.
Yeah, there's one question which is actually in the Q&A box, and all the rest of them are comments or questions in the chat box. And the question in the Q&A box was directed at Tim Oates, and it is, why do you really think that schools are mindful of the English baccalaureate, Tim?
Right. I mean, I think that the IB is interesting because it does emphasise a series of holistic ideas that should permeate the curriculum. And we tend to think in England of building the curriculum in secondary school out of the building blocks of individual qualifications, which causes us to lose sight of things which should permeate all learning, such as the kinds of approaches to oracy that we're emphasising today. So I think that's a distinctive feature of IB provision.
Thank you very much indeed. And sorry, Robin, yes?
Ian, there's another question coming on the Q&A box to which you drew our attention, which is really for me, I think, from Paul Stanley. He asks, do any of our speakers know of any trials which have looked at the impact of a quality oracy curriculum on raising attainment of disadvantaged pupils? I was the only person who mentioned the Education Endowment Foundation. And I co-led the biggest trial, Neil says it's the biggest trial in the world, of dialogic teaching, which produced, as I said in my presentation, very successful outcomes. After only 20 weeks, pupils in the experimental group, the intervention group, their test scores were raised by up to 2 months. It was a remarkable outcome. And in fact, there are 3 related projects: ours, the dialogic teaching one, the philosophy for children one, and a science one that the Education Endowment Foundation has sponsored randomized controlled trials of. And these are totally independent trials. So while I and my team developed the strategy, another university came in and did the evaluation. So Paul Stanley, if you're still there, do look on the Education Endowment Foundation website.
And there's a question from Lainey Franks. How much training do teachers need to support oracy learning in school? And are there particular ages that are most important if you had to prioritise a key stage? Anyone want to come in on that? Neil, yes? Need to unmute me.
I've got it.
Yeah.
I think that teachers need systematic training in how to do this. And we do it at Cambridge with our primary PGCE training. They need to be able to focus on different kinds of of oracy skills, looking at, we have an oracy framework which describes all the skills, and they need to work through so that they're able to see what skills different children have and different profiles that children have. Some of them may be great at speaking in public, but they never listen to anybody in a group. Or other ones are very good at chairing a meeting, but ask them to stand up afterwards and say what the group found, they just dry up. Other people are quite good at speaking, but not at actually listening and summarizing what they've heard. So there are lots of different ways that children differ. And so there's a way that the teachers have to become aware of the range of skills. And then they need teaching in the strategies for helping children develop those particular skills. So it takes quite a bit of time, and it's a significant component of a course. And at present, because the course is so crowded, it's very hard to fit that in. So I think that's one reason. I think it has to be a statutory part of what teachers are taught if it's going to be given enough time.
Thank you very much indeed. Right. Yes, certainly.
Chair, could I just reinforce very much what Neil has said? I mean, I think all of the expert witnesses today have actually emphasised the extent to which there are some misleading and misleading features of oracy in a general sense. You know, oral exchange is a natural part of human interaction, but the classroom is a setting in which the more normal processes outside of schooling often suspended for the purposes of very specific learning objectives. And therefore the kind of natural processes that people would take for granted, you know, just assume that oracy is occurring in an effective way. Oh, it's easy because it's a natural part of human existence. It doesn't apply here. What we're talking about are the application of very specific practices. Now, we have been good at the past in introducing national initiatives which introduce teachers to particular bodies of evidence and particular practices. We've tended to lapse into either using a legal framework like the national curriculum or quasi-legal instruments like national qualifications. I think we have to return to understanding what public policy looks like in respect of appropriate staff development, in respect of a very specific thing that we're trying to encourage in education. It is something which is present in many education systems around the world, but somewhat absent from ours. There's this ability to encourage enactment of something very specific through high quality professional development.
Thank you very much, Tim. We are going to do a sort of YouTube of the entire event, so the questions and answers will also be part of that. Lord Watson was with us earlier on, and he said many thanks to all panellists for such insightful and thought-provoking contributions. He's got one question for Sarah, though, and that is, why doesn't Ofsted include oracy in its inspections? And apologies for having to leave. Sarah,
do you want me to lead with that one, Ian? Hi, it's Jonathan here. So. Yeah. I think it is an important question, and you know, I particularly reflect on Mary's comments earlier on. With the education inspection framework, we place curriculum at the heart of all the discussions that we have in school. And of course, as our colleagues have outlined through the afternoon, it's in those discussions where we start to unpick the building blocks that leaders have formulated to help pupils achieve those really kind of high level outcomes. And that's what's key, really. So we look at spoken language through the national curriculum, through the early years foundation stage. We speak to the early years leaders about how they organise communication and language in early years. I think most importantly, of course, as well, we look at reading, and we look at reading very carefully. So we consider some very specific criteria and assure ourselves that pupils have those very early opportunities to learn to read confidently, gain all of that important vocabulary so that they have confidence in spoken language. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much indeed. We've also been joined by Margaret Greenwood, and we did have with us earlier Rachel Hopkins, who's had to leave. It's part of the nature of the beast that MPs and members of the House of Lords come and go at these meetings because the diary is so full. So, Margaret, was there any particular questions that you had for the panellists? You're muted, Margaret. Sorry. You need to unmute.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much. I'm so sorry I've missed this, but I'm pleased I'm going to be able to catch up on YouTube. I've got a couple of questions that have been forwarded to me. Unfortunately, I've missed most of the presentation, so I don't want to ask a question that you know, that may have already been answered. I would just like to say, you know, I used to be an English teacher at a time when GCSE English oral work had a mark alongside the written work, and I was a young teacher at the time, and my experience was that it was an incredibly positive and constructive part of the curriculum, because essentially as a teacher you could say at the start of the year, everything you say in any class will contribute to your overall mark, and it sort of, to my mind, gave the pupils a sense of ownership of their own interactions within the classroom, because it was 100% coursework. So I thought it was incredibly useful, and what we found when we did the various activities that they had to do, but for example, when we did the presenting a speech, so they all had to do a speech, you know, they all kind of, I don't know, the quality was fantastic, and they all sort of entered into the spirit of it in a really powerful way. And I think it's very good as well, because you get, you know, certain pupils who aren't particularly good at the written coursework, but very good in terms of delivering orally. So that's just my background experience. But these are two questions that have been forwarded to me from Gemma Carroll. One, she wanted to find out more about whether it's greater accountability or higher stakes from schools and teachers, or something else that would be most important, increasing the value and delivery of oracy in classroom in the long term. She mentions that Tim Oates focused on this well in terms of needing a greater focus on professional development, but she'd like to get everyone's view on that. And then the other question that she's asking is, it'd be helpful to ask the witnesses about the value of the current oral language component of the English GCSE.
Right. Anyone want to come in on that? Alison? Sorry, I'll bring Alison in first. Sorry, Sarah. Alison?
Yeah, just to say, I agree it's about professional development, but it's also about the agency of the teaching profession. So if you aren't asked your opinion as a teacher, if you're not expected to contribute to the debate, you're unlikely to see the point of asking your students what they think about something, because probably you'll be driven by another agenda, which is about time and doing what you feel you need to do to prove to someone else that you've done a good enough job. So I think that, you know, the story that I was sharing about the school that I led from special measures to outstanding was all about creating that culture where voice really matters. And then all those kinds of voices, whether it's the presentational voice, whether it's the voice that's doing the reading aloud or debating or arguing a point, all of those voices are really intrinsic and really matter. And I think it's the teacher's voice as well in all of that, because just to say, there was only one teacher that needed to leave. Every other teacher stayed and the school became outstanding. So it's also that whole community voice that really counts, I think.
Thank you very much indeed. Anyone else? Sarah, you wanted to come in on this?
I just wanted to come in about the GCSEs and just mention that, and just say a little bit about what teachers have sort of spoken to me about, perhaps at conferences and perhaps more informally. And that is about the fact that I think when the new GCSEs came in with the emphasis on 19th century literature in the language exam, I think initially that did raise the bar, and their initial responses were, in some cases, to teach a bit more to the test. And they've been quite honest about that and said, look, initially we did teach to the test, but now we're reviewing what we did in the first instance and thinking more about the substance and integrity of the curriculum and what really matters. And you spoke from the heart of an English teacher. What really matters to pupils is that ability, isn't it, to really be able to talk about the ideas and themes, etc., in texts, because that is a disciplinary practice within English. And I think, I think one of the things our framework has done, and I know people are kind of asking us about that, is in that quality of education through our discussions with leaders, particularly subject leaders, who we really spend a lot of time talking to. We ask them about what they think is really important in their subject, what they think the curriculum most needs to develop. And by talking about sort of integrity and substance and shifting the emphasis from sort of teaching to the test, I do think that we've kind of started that that debate, and schools are beginning to respond to that. Now we're in the early stages of that framework, and obviously it was kind of, to a certain extent, when COVID came, it was kind of slightly halted. But that's my feeling from talking to talking with others and professionals. So just to answer that English question. I can see in the chat bar there's quite a lot about standard English, but I don't know whether people want to kind of leave that, and we can come back to that at another point.
Right. Tim, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Chair. So we know that we can introduce specific assessments. If they're very carefully designed, they can have beneficial outcomes. Now, although the phonics check in year 1 remains controversial, the outcome has been a very strong emphasis on reading and information provided for schools as well as the state on early reading. But it's much more challenging in relationship to oracy. And I want to just pick up the GCSE point and then also think about what we're trying to achieve. Now, it's clear that having something in a national qualification, like a GCSE, strongly signals things. There's general signalling that it is important. That can be a good thing. However, when we look at the kind of characteristics which coursework has in something like English, we find that and you know, we've reviewed this for decades, that the marks are all crashed up at the top end. And it's clear that at this point, the assessment is simply seen as a very specific hurdle by the majority of schools, you know, to be achieved possibly by whatever means. Now we're not talking about this in relationship to encouraging the permeation of high quality interaction between teacher and pupil, between pupils, across the whole of the curriculum. And we need to enter in discussion of assessment extremely carefully, because the powerful washback into teacher practice is all too evident time and time again. So I think we're in quite challenging public policy territory here. We want to try and influence all schools, we want to try and influence all teachers, and we want to try to encourage a very specific set of practices. And in my mind, and from the evidence of history, simply assuming that you can achieve it through the introduction of an assessment at one or more stages is actually flying in the face of historical evidence.
The question I think that Sarah was referring to was from Ian Cushing, and his question is, I wonder whether Sarah might comment further on her description of standard English as the language habits of those in power. It seems to me that this view of language risks delegitimizing non-standard varieties and only further grants power to standard English and the social groups it is associated with. One material consequence of this is that non-standard dialects and accents get heavily policed and banned in classrooms, as much research has shown. I've got a particular interest in that. I'm not sure why, but as you could see that my time as a Wickhamist might have been wasted. But there we go.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that question from Ian as well. This is something we're aware of. I think the banning refers to a report that was published a long time ago, 2013, and we've been through 2 frameworks since then. But it's a really important question, and it is highly nuanced. So, you know, it's not going to create a kind of simple soundbite, but obviously, you know, the national curriculum in terms of spoken language talks about an increasing command of standard English. And I think where we are, it's not, from where I am, it's not a negative thing. It's not about demeaning or putting accents down or pronunciation, but it is about that empowering of pupils to be able to speak truth to power. Because if we're going to speak truth to power, which is that important part of being a citizen, we know that that standard English will get the message across. So it's not about doing an accent down or a dialect down. It's about, first of all, knowing about register and appropriateness and different forms, informal and formal. So there's quite a lot of knowledge goes into that. But it's also that recognition of kind of being able to, having the capacity to take part fully in the democratic process and being able to speak truth to power. And that's an important part of social justice. So that's where I'm coming from. It's not a negative, it's a positive, but I know others have different views.
Okay.
Ian,
right.
can
Robin,
I say
yeah?
something about that?
Yeah, sorry, I've got Robin, and I'll bring you in, Neil, okay?
Yeah, thank you, that's fine.
Yeah.
I suspect Neil and I will overlap on this. Standard English is one register among many, and it's a privileged register. And of course, all pupils should learn to use it. But the other registers shouldn't be devalued. I said at the beginning of my contribution that we need to understand the history as much as we need to understand the evidence. It really is terribly important to note how political the debate about Standard English has become. Standard English was what's the concern about Standard English was what scuppered language in the national curriculum, an excellent program back in the 1990s, and indeed the similarly excellent National Oracy project. We somehow have to disentangle the politics from the debate about registers. And of course, it's a matter of common sense. Children need different registers for different circumstances. And one of those registers is Standard English. As simple as that.
Right. Neil and then Tim.
Yes, I agree entirely with that and with what Sarah and Robin have said. The point is, if it's being taught in schools that the way children talk in their communities, with their friends, with their parents or whatever, whether that's a different language or a different variety of English, is bad, and that the Standard English that the posher people speak in society is good, that's just bad teaching. It's a prejudice being pursued in that way. It's as bad as prejudice against ethnic groups or against disability or whatever. And it shouldn't be taught in that way. What the other speakers have quite rightly emphasised is that children need to be taught about how language is perceived in the social context and how in different situations, the way you speak will influence what you can get done. And that there's no reason, I mean, neither Ian or my career seem to have been held up by the fact that, oh my God, yeah, I can talk however I like. And I don't think that matters. What you've got to do is teach them about language, and then they will perceive the importance of broadening their repertoire so that they can exist and communicate well in a range of situations. And people who have access to a regional dialect, which isn't Standard English, have an advantage, just as bilingual speakers do, in that they can take part in communities that people who only have Standard English have not got. And we should remember, for example, at one time in Wales, the Welsh language was considered a bad thing in schools, and children had to wear the Welsh knot because they weren't allowed to speak Welsh in the classroom. So these attitudes still persist in some ways. And I think it's important that children are taught about these attitudes and that they have no ground in actual linguistics, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tim and then Alison.
Thank you, Chair. And I will just add, I think what I'm going to say is complementary to both what Robin has emphasised and Neil has emphasised, but I want to really emphasise the cognitive aspects of oracy. I mean, language and thought are profoundly entwined. So 3 quick things. If you refer to somebody as disinterested, when you mean that they're uninterested, it represents a confusion of thought. And we are not in emphasising the formal and deliberate acquisition of a wider language repertoire of somehow being antithetical either to clarity or creativity. So this entwined nature of cognition and language, I think, is critical. Only when you have this repertoire and deep experience and the ability to access this broad repertoire as a young person, can you be truly clear in your own mind and communicate to others who did what when, and which way round causation is, and so on. So this issue of the cognitive aspects of oracy, improving and enhancing cognitive ability as well as the affective and communicative dimensions of oracy, which Robin and Neil have referred to, is fundamental to the way in which oracy was built into the national curriculum and fundamental to what we should be achieving for all pupils in all schools.
Thank you very much. Alison? You need to unmute, thank you.
Thank you. Just very quickly wanted to pick something up that was in the chat bar. So we ran a session a couple of weeks ago about valuing heritage languages, how important it is to value the child's first language. and to recognise that actually it's an advantage to speak more than one language. And for too long in schools, we've seen EAL as some kind of link with deprivation or disadvantage or deficit, just to emphasise the importance of EAL and the skill that enhances.
Thank you very much. Now, Gemma, if I could come back to you just for a moment, there are a number of questions and points which have been put into the chat bar and the Q&A. Could we capture those and could I impose upon our guest speakers if we can actually capture those questions and circulate them and ask you to give us brief answers to them afterwards, so we can circulate that with the content of today's webinar as well? Would that be all right?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that'd be a great idea. Brilliant.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Well, I know it's a great idea from our perspective, Gemma, but I'm asking our guests because it's imposing on their kindness, you know. Okay. I mean, back to your point, Neil. I remember my own time at school, you know, where I had a language that I used in the playground and out with my mates, and I had a language I used in the classroom, and I had a quite different language that I used at home. You know, and you know, it was about horses for courses. And you know, there were certain things I would say in the playground with my mates that I wouldn't dream of saying in front of me mum or in the classroom. And it's amazing how young people, you know, do it, adapt in that way, but some don't do it as well as others. And so therefore, you know, the importance of this, the use of language skill is so vitally important from that perspective. And I really think it's going to be even much more important probably after youngsters having missed so much time at school, because they'll have to re-socialise into the way of working in a school and classroom setting after 4 or 5 months without of school. And that there is a question from Rachel Russell in the Q&A box, and she says, I feel schools are feeling pressure to cover lots of content when returning in September after such a long period of remote teaching. How could I endeavour to encourage senior leadership team to include this Oracy training teaching as instrumental in bridging gaps and building confidence on our return? Robin, yeah?
Yeah. Oracy isn't content. I mean, there is a content there, but the point I made in part of my presentation was that talk goes on anyway. Mm-hmm. One of the questions we were asked to address was, how can more time be made for talk? And I said, actually, that's the wrong question. It's how can we use time better? And so from that point of view, I wouldn't be unduly worried about Oracy creating a particular additional pressure back in September. Other things will do, but this is one that will not. The question, as I said, is how to use talk more effectively.
Yeah. Tim?
Thank you, Chair. So what we know, both from research and from direct experience of the gap in the cessation of schooling that's occurred, is that the gaps that have opened up will be highly individual in their nature. Even the most, we've written extensively recently about how even the most able kids will have focused on their preferences. And this will be true right the way across the ability range. What has been emphasised in the presentations today is that oral exchange allows a window into the thinking of each child. And so in terms of the question from the teacher, an enhanced focus on oracy, on return to school, allows teachers and the school to do what John Hattie's research shows us was effective and influential after the Christchurch earthquake. Standards rose because teachers began to focus on the misconceptions and gaps in individuals' learning. Mm-hmm. And of course, if the oral exchange increases and children know that they're being attended to individually, that emotionally ties them back into schooling, reintegrates them back into the institution, which is absolutely critical after this gap in learning. So I would argue this is just fundamental. We have to move to a highly individualized phase of learning, but using the kind of evidence which we can derive from the previous gaps, like the cessation after Katrina, like the cessation in schooling after the Christchurch earthquake.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else, please? in that case, we've got about 5 minutes left, and rather than starting on a separate question, I was just wondering if we could go around the panel and just see if there's any final thoughts you'd like to add, just to wrap things up today. Alison, can I begin with you, please? There's no reason I've begun with Alison other than she's in the top left-hand corner of my screen. So, Alison, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. So just to thank you for the opportunity and to emphasise the importance of professional learning and professional agency. We need to trust our teachers to trust our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
Well, I think we've heard compelling narrative that we don't need additional research to understand what we need to achieve. And we know that specific interpretations, theorizations, and applications of oracy impact beneficially on attainment and equity. We also know that some of the legal frameworks, such as the national curriculum, already incorporate those understandings. We have a problem of enactment, and we have the challenge of encouraging these practices in the kind of context where we've emphasized the autonomy of schools. But at the same time that we've been emphasizing the autonomy of schools, we've also been saying, but we want you to engage in highly evidence-based and very specific practices. Now, that is a bit of a contradiction.
Thank you.
The only way out of it is to generate a professional consensus, I think. The legal instruments are good. We need good enactment. We need good public policy and support from the centre.
Thank you very much. And Sarah and Jonathan, from an Ofsted perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Well, no, thank you for inviting us along today. And as we said all the way through, we'll continue our work with the Education Inspection Framework, where we specifically focus on the curriculum and how spoken language is supported in all of the work that leaders and teachers do in teaching those that subject content as they go through the year. Sarah, any closing thoughts from you?
No, I think you've captured it all, Jonathan, there, just to say how delighted we've been to be invited. And just some of the common threads that are coming through noticeably about the importance of having language, having vocabulary and relationship to thinking and learning, that being a common thread, which I found very interesting.
Thank you very much. And Mary? You need to unmute it.
Just to echo Tim's point about the research highlighted by Hattie, very concerned about the narrative of the paucity of experience for virtually all children. This is not the case. And I think we've got to, aim for a pitch higher. And the work that's come out of Hurricane Katrina and of the earthquakes in New Zealand point to a completely different story. And what's underpinning that? It's been high quality talk and listening. So go and have a look at those. It's a very easy read. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Neil, please.
Yeah, as long as it's in our society.
Sorry, Neil, we just lost you there for a moment.
Well. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we just lost you there for a moment. Could you start again?
Yeah, thanks. As long as it's only the privileged students in our society who are taught how to use spoken language confidently and well, it'll continue to be a barrier to equality and social mobility. So that needs to change.
Thank you very much indeed. And Robin?
Yes, as on one or two previous occasions, I'm afraid I'm going to have to take issue with Tim about the national curriculum. He's far more sanguine about what it offers. He says we have a legal framework, the problem is enactment. I really don't think, certainly if you look at the requirements for years 1 to 6, that it's anything approaching adequate. As I say, 2 pages, barely 2 pages, as opposed to 80 pages on reading and writing. Neil, Jim Rose and I were in on these discussions and actually tried to help draft this after, Tim, you had completed your review, and it was an incredible struggle. There was a lot of political opposition to getting anything in there at all. And until that perception has changed, I think we're going to continue to have difficulties here.
Thank you very much. And as I suggested earlier on, it is time for us to finish. But as I suggested earlier on, Gemma, our very, very capable organiser, and thank you, Gemma, for organising today, is capturing the questions. We will circulate them around our panel, try and get answers if we can, and circulate the answers. So can I thank everyone for their attendance? Gemma, is there anything I need to add?
No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Can I thank everyone for their attendance? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Much appreciated, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.